Shana Tova, everyone. Imagine, if you will, this scenario. A trolley is running out of control down a track. In its path are 5 people who have been tied to that track by a mad philosopher. Fortunately, you can pull a lever, flip a switch, and that will lead the trolley down a different track to safety. Unfortunately, the mad philosopher has anticipated your maneuver, and there is still a single person tied to that track. So, if you pull the lever, if you flip the switch, 1 person will die. If you don't, 5 will. Should you flip the switch or do nothing? Which is the more ethical option? Now, this is a hypothetical situation created by an ethicist named Philippa Foot. In real life, you'd have other options, right? So there would be people who'd be trying to deny the whole thing and say that trolleys are a hoax, or try to figure out how to kill all 6 and make money while doing it. But here we're limited to just those 2 scenarios. And take a moment and think. 5 or 1? What would you do? Take a moment and think. If you are faced with a tough choice like this, is it better to act or not to act? Now, by the way, philosophy departments and psychology departments of universities have done studies, and about 90% of people say that they would pull the lever and save the 5 at the expense of the 1. About 70% of professional philosophers would also use the switch. 8% would not, and 20% have not yet completed their answer. On the other hand, change the question just a little bit. Say you could stop the train by pushing someone onto the track. His body would stop the train and save the 5. What would you say now? And by the way, for most people, the answer changes. Most of the people who would pull the lever would not push the man onto the tracks because their reasoning goes, when you pull the lever, you're not killing someone directly, but when you're pushing someone, you are. This is, of course, just a hypothetical problem. The Atlanta streetcar runs so slowly and infrequently that you'd have time to get everyone off the tracks and get coffee. You're just standing there yelling, "Stella!" But in fact, this question has real-world implications and applications in the strangest places, in medicine, in wartime, in technology, and in some of the thorniest issues that we have faced this year. And fortunately, our Jewish tradition offers some wisdom as to how to answer these questions. I suppose on a deeper level, one of the things that this question raises for us is whether it is the intent or the results that matter. If you are doing something that would otherwise be wrong, but you're doing it for the right reasons, for the greater good, does that justify it? Does the intent of your actions change the meaning of the results? And that's a particularly pertinent question as we engage in the process of tshuva, exploring our actions and their motivations this past year. And we think about our values, our intentions for the year ahead. How does a trolley take us to tshuva? Well, you can start with a real-world question. Autonomous vehicles, autonomous cars. Now, it may be decades until cars get as snarky as Knight Rider, but autonomous vehicles are here, and they are even now getting into accidents. Human drivers are often forced to make split-second decisions. Should they brake or try to gun it through the intersection? If they can't stop, where should they steer? And many human beings make foolish choices in the moment. I mentioned in my sermon 2 years ago, my son took a driver's education course where they were trained not to swerve, and in fact to intentionally run over a squirrel. Fortunately, it was a fake squirrel for the exercise. Now, this was not just for fun, although I'm sure if my cats could drive, they would disagree. but because hundreds of people die every year swerving to avoid pets and small animals. Now, logically, you know that your life is worth more than that of a household pet or a squirrel, though again, our cats might disagree. But in the moment you pull that lever in a way that sacrifices your life for the life of a rodent, you had a noble intent, preserving life, but ended up with a bad result, saving the life of a rodent of usual size. Now, cars on their own don't have intention. A car driven by a computer can't go on its gut. It follows the rules set by its programmers. A Tesla on autopilot should presumably, flawlessly, hit the squirrel every time to save its driver. But that means, by the way, that somewhere in the code that steers that car, there is a formula that determines what to do when lives are in the balance. Somewhere in that programming, somewhere on some chip or hard drive, is a formula that computes the value of a human life and solves for X. And the computer has to be given the tools to decide, if I can avoid a collision with a school bus, but it means hitting a pedestrian, is it worth it? If I could avoid hitting a school bus, but I end up killing one of my own passengers, is that worth it? On these high holidays, of course, the questions of who will live and who will die are not just theoretical and not just left for programmers. COVID has posed for us a range of these questions. So earlier this spring, as cases were starting to increase and spiral out of control, there was a fear that some cities and hospitals would run out of respirators. And there were certain drugs that people had hoped would help patients, but some of those were in very short supply. While I was busy figuring out how to make Zoom kosher, some of my colleagues on the law committee were asked that question. If you have a choice between trying to save one really sick patient or two who are slightly better, how do you decide? Which lever do you pull? Should priority be given to medical personnel, to people who are younger or healthier? Do you say anyone who has a pre-existing condition or disability should go to the bottom of the list? Do you prioritize citizens? Do you prioritize people who can afford to pay? What if someone's already on a respirator? Can you pull them off to give that resource to someone who has a better chance? How do you balance life against life? It's not just when a trolley is hurtling toward you that you have to decide which track you are going to take. But that's not the only place these questions come up. A lot of us are thinking about the question of sending kids back to school. And we struggled with that in my own family. We ended up having two of my kids stay home to limit the chance we would have to deal with an exposure that would force us to isolate during the holiday. Now, the day after Yom Kippur, if they are not back in school, I am calling the greatest poet of the pandemic, Sarah Kogan, and asking her to do a contactless vodka drop-off. Now, I mentioned that we have two kids at home, but Wendy is motioning to me that, in fact, and reminding me that we have three. Why are two at home and why is one back already? It's not because I love one more or less. I see my kids are debating which one it is. It's actually a calculation of risk versus reward, of who needed it. School closures are not just inconvenient for parents. They can cause real harm to children. The Berman Center runs an outpatient program called Evolve for teens who are living with mental health issues. That program has never been more full than it is right now. So it's one thing for me to choose the answer that is best for my own children and my own family. But if I'm thinking ethically, how do I balance the well-being of my children against the risk of serious illness or death for their teachers? How do I balance the risk of my children against the risks to people who I might expose when I come into contact with them? How do we make those calculations of life against life? One way or another, you have to answer the question, and even the best Excel pivot table will not help. Sometimes life is tough choices, and anyone who tells you differently is selling you something. Now, our Jewish tradition has some answers, and philosophy in general gives us a way to approach this question. So the go-to Jewish answer is called deontology. There's an absolute set of rules. If you will, God said so. And sometimes the Torah gives us very clear answers to questions. If my ox gores your ox, I have to pay. If you have leprosy, you quarantine for up to 2 weeks, even if it means losing face. If there is a stranger, a foreigner in your midst in need of assistance, you are obligated to help them. But what about balancing one life against another? The Torah is pretty clear about do not murder. You can't kill an innocent person. But on the other hand, the Torah also says that a person who gathers sticks on Shabbat or a rebellious child must be put to death. The problem is that the Torah doesn't give us specific instructions on how to extend those rules to respirators and manufactured trolley accidents. And by the way, sometimes deontology gives us answers that are not satisfying at all. Yesterday, we read the story of Abraham sending Ishmael into the dangerous desert. Abraham risked the life of his son Ishmael in favor of the life and well-being of his favorite son Isaac, because God told him to listen to Sarah. And this seems like a clear answer, a clear case of sacrificing one life to save another. Now, today we read an even tougher story of the binding of Isaac. Now, despite the fact that Abraham almost killed his son, deontologically, he's in the clear. God told me to is the only answer that you need if that is your approach to life. The fact that God was just testing and a ram got subbed in at the last minute makes things a little easier if you're a dyed-in-the-wool deontologist. But it still rubs us the wrong way. And sometimes, though, deontology doesn't give us the answer at all. And so even if we are looking to the Bible for guidance, we still have to look at other philosophical approaches to tell us how to interpret what the Bible tells us to do. The second approach could be called virtue or character ethics. In the most extreme form, the question is not the overall outcome, but your own moral stature and personal development. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but this view might lead me to say, you know what, if I pull that lever, I'm responsible for the death of a human being. If I don't, bad things might happen, but it's not my fault. My hands are clean. Virtue ethics can be unsatisfying when faced with real and messy situations. Virtue ethics don't work in wartime, when sometimes we know that we must take another life in order to save the lives of others. Or then there is the case in 1979, there were terrorists who attacked a home, an Israeli home, and the mother ended up smothering her baby while trying to stop that baby from crying to reveal their location. There are comparable, although not as well documented, stories from the Holocaust, and this example was famously fictionalized in the season finale, in the series finale of MASH. Abraham could almost kill his son because God told him to. Would you take that as your precedent? If you let the child cry, your hands might be clean, but those hands would also be cold and dead. So there's a third philosophical approach called consequentialism, or in an extreme form, utilitarianism, which is you judge your actions based on the outcome. If more people are alive at the end of the story, you've done the right thing. At the extreme, this answer can be very dangerous. Imagine this parallel case. You are a doctor in a hospital, and you have 5 patients awaiting transplant. One traveler walks in with a slight ear infection. You've done a blood test, and you've determined that he is a perfect match for your 5 patients. One clop on the noggin, some sawing, some sewing, and you have saved 5 lives for one. The end result is no different from the trolley, but a lot of people who would otherwise pull the lever would not approve of this approach. If nothing else, insurance won't pay for it because it's out of network. The trolley problem challenges us to ask, is life about our moral character, or is life about the results of our actions? Is life about being good or doing good? And by the way, our Jewish tradition does offer some very subtle guidance to distinguish the answers to this question. In the Talmud, the rabbis conclude that if you are asked to kill another person to save your life, you are not allowed to do so. They say, who knows whose blood is redder? Since every life is of infinite value, I cannot take your life to save my own. The lever goes unpulled. The man goes unpushed. The 5 would die, it would seem. But there's a bit of an asterisk. There's a story in the book of Samuel about a man named Sheva ben Bichri who rebels against King David. He ends up taking refuge in a particular town. And David's general, Joab, who is the king of the utilitarians, besieges the town with his army, the intent of destroying it in order to capture and kill this one rebel. A clever woman calls out to Joab, "Why do you come to destroy a mother city in Israel? Why destroy a community?" Joab explains, "I don't want the whole town. I just want that rebel, Sheba, son of Bichri." And the wise woman responds, "Do you really want all of Sheva? Or can we just throw you his head?" And Joab is just fine with that. Sheba finds out that he has nobody, and the wise woman pulled the lever and saved a town at the expense of one man. Our later sources interpret this story to mean that, yes, you cannot turn over an innocent life to save others, but there's a little bit of an exception. There's a little bit of wiggle room. If someone is not entirely innocent or has already been singled out, if attackers demand a particular person, you can save others at their expense. So I can't steal the organs of the traveler, but I can pick which of the 5 to save. So those texts guided how we answered the questions about the scarce medicine and respirators. On the one hand, you can remove someone from a respirator if you know they will not survive no matter what. But you cannot pull someone off because somebody else has a better chance. You can give medical personnel first priority at receiving vaccines and protective equipment, but it's not right to send people to the bottom of the list because you value someone else's life more. Over the past months, by the way, there have been hospitals that have had to make those kinds of choices. And I pray that those days will soon be behind us. Very few of us will ever have to choose to pull a trolley lever or assign a respirator. But each of us makes ethical choices every day, some very mild, some with lasting implications. And the broader question of whether we base our actions on absolute values or outcomes is one that we cannot avoid. And those questions are among the things that keep me up at night. And they inform our own decisions about when the synagogue resumes certain activities. Should we offer an activity, a service, a program, if in absolute terms, yes, it carries a risk to people participating, but in relative terms, it is safer than other options that people might choose otherwise? We know that if we hold a bar mitzvah service on our property, that we can reduce but not eliminate risk. But what if the alternative is 20 people crammed into someone's living room? Virtue ethics would say, other people will do what they will do. You do the right thing. Consequentialist ethics says, if everyone else ends up safer overall, you come out ahead. Is it better to do good or to be good? But obviously, this is not just an issue for this time and this year. We all make choices every day. We are firmly right now in the season of considering our values, our good deeds, our wrongdoing. Are we judged on the intent or the results? Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the altar gets off the hook because the deontologists save him and say, well, he was doing God's word, so he gets a get-out-of-jail-free card because God told him to. The consequentialists say, well, all's well that end well. Everyone came out okay except for the ram. But in fact, that's not entirely true. If you read the story carefully, the next thing that happens is that Sarah dies. And the sages say that Sarah died of the shock of hearing what her husband had done. And by the way, Isaac and Abraham, there are questions about how their relationship evolved and was harmed by the incident. Abraham is known, really, as someone who pulls the lever. Abraham is a man who goes to war to save the people of Sodom, sinners, and pleads for their well-being. Abraham is known as a person who sends away Ishmael to save Isaac. Abraham is a person who intervenes in the lives of others. In contrast, you have Noah. Noah hears that the world is going to be destroyed, and he builds a boat and doesn't worry about anyone else. Abraham is the example of consequentialist ethics. Noah lives a life of value ethics. I did the right thing. Everyone else, they're going to have to figure it out for themselves. In the tractate Sanhedrin and the Talmud, the rabbis debate who was better. And Rabbi Yochanan says, "Bedorotav velo bedorot acheret," because the Torah says that Noah was a righteous man in his generation. Rabbi Yochanan says he was okay in his generation. In any other generation, he would have been no big deal. Resh Lakish, another sage, says, "Bedorotav vekal v'chomer bedorot achirim," that in fact Noah was even greater, because if he had lived at a time when he was in a better environment, he would have been even more amazing than Abraham. Noah knew how to be good. Abraham knew how to do good. Noah was alone in his ark, safe with the animals. Abraham was out there getting his hands dirty. The battle between intent and results is so basic to our experience to life. Do the ends justify the means? Does it matter what you did or what you meant to do? Should we try to be good or to do good? On Yom Kippur, in just a few days, as we seek atonement, we will use many words for sin. There is pesha, which is intentional rebellion against God. Pesha means you are out there tying people to the track. The more common scenario is chet. Chet is a kind of sin where you try to do the right thing, but you miss the mark. I have a lever. I don't know whether to pull it or not. The philosopher's not getting the answer. What do I do? If I make the wrong choice, that's a chet. There's one more kind, though, which is avon. Avon is when you act without contemplating at all the intention or the implications of your answers. Avon, you are not the mad philosopher. You are not the guy with the lever. Avon is when you are the trolley, hurtling down the track of your life, not caring who is in the way. The process of tshuva is about trying to get our lives on the right track. The process of tshuva recognizes that we cannot change our past actions. Sometimes the track of our behavior has already been set. And you can't change what has happened. If you cheated and stole, even if you return your ill-gotten gains, the offense still exists. If you used harsh, and damaging words against someone, that pain is not just going to go away. But what you can change is your intentions. You can seek to give new meaning to your deeds. In essence, what tshuva does is it says you are no longer committing avon. You are no longer just hurtling mindlessly down a track. It's a chet. You're trying to pull a lever at least. You're trying to turn onto the right track in your own life. We know that no matter what we do in life, we are sometimes going to cause harm, even if only as a side effect. We mean to offer someone helpful advice, but it causes insult. We mean to promote a worthy value, but we end up causing harm to those in our way. We think what we will doing will save and protect life, and we guess wrong. We know that no matter what we do, we are going to be faced with conundrums and imperfect choices, answers that even the most sophisticated computer can't give us. Sometimes the answer is to pull the lever. Sometimes not. Sometimes you have to march your child up the mountain like Abraham. Sometimes you have to sit in the ark like Noah. We can only hope that at each moment our decisions are guided by our truest values as to whether we try to do good or to be good. My prayer, friends, may this be a year where we face our tough choices with courage. May this be a year when we face those tough choices with an appreciation of just how tough they are. May this be a year where we face those tough choices armed with the wisdom of our tradition. May this be a year when we face those tough choices with the support of community. May this be a year when God guides our hand whether to pull that lever. May this be a year when we can be good and do good. May this be a year when our lives end up on the right track. Shana Tova. We continue now